Welcome back to another video. Let's discuss how often you should train a muscle group, all right? So I think that it's better to think about this in terms of how much total volume am I doing each week for a particular muscle, and how many sets per session would it make sense to do for this muscle. So if you want to figure out how much total volume to do in a single week, check out last week's video. But let's say that you find, all right, for this muscle group, for this particular training week, 15 sets make sense. Let's say it's your chest, the chesticles. I shouldn't be allowed to put videos on the internet, but let's say it's 15 sets for your chest. How many sessions should you split that up into during a week? Well, how many sets per session might make sense for a muscle? And I think that the answer to this, and credit to Dr. Mike Israetel for pioneering some of this information on single session muscle groups, and he puts out a lot of great information in regards to this, and a lot of other experts in the field do as well, so ain't just me here, but I think that it makes sense to stick around 3 to 8 to 10 sets per muscle per session. And why do I think this? Well, I think that if you're going much above 8 to 10 sets per session, you might be getting into some junk volume territory. And junk volume is basically just moving weight around when you're tired, not really getting additional stimulus for the work you're doing, but you're getting additional fatigue. So it's adding recovery resources or a need to recover, but it's not really giving you many good returns. You're not getting a very good return on your investment of that time and that work. And I think that going much above 8 to 10 sets kind of results in this junk volume because, for one, I think that there's probably going to be far diminishing returns on a per set basis above, how much of a stimulus for that muscle group are you actually getting after your 6th or 7th set? I would say you're going to get far diminishing returns from there. And much above 10, are you really getting much of an additional stimulus? Like, let's say that you can fill up your stimulus for a single muscle group up to 100% for a single session. Well, maybe 6 or 7 sets gets you to 90, 95%. And then for each additional set, maybe you're only getting 2 or 3% and getting far diminishing returns for each additional set from there. And this is totally just throwing out numbers, but just to make this an example. So I think that beyond that, you might be better off putting that volume on a different day so you can kind of fill up that percent of gains that you can get across more days. So across the entire week, you have more of that percent gains. So if you're doing 15 sets for your chest in a single week, it might be a good idea to do more so 6 or 7 sets across 3 different sessions to get you up to 90, 95% of that stimulation on 3 different sessions, adding up to like 260-ish% across the entire week, rather than just 2 sessions, but getting a little bit more of a percent for those 2 sessions. So let's say you do 2 sessions, but instead of 90%, you get 95%. Well, that only leaves you with 190% across the single week instead of the 2 sessions. And now, this is not me saying that 3 days instead of 2 days is going to get you 100% more gains or anything like that. No, definitely not saying that. But what I am saying is I think that you might maximize your stimulative volume a little bit more by training a little bit more frequently, especially on muscle groups that might be able to handle a little bit more volume. So like your chest, if you're doing 20 sets of chest, I think that 2 sessions, probably still getting a pretty good stimulus to fatigue ratio, but maybe 3 sessions might give you a little bit better. Additionally, I think that the systemic fatigue in a single session is something you have to consider as well. And Chris Beardsley has talked about it before, to where often we see a little bit better strength and potentially muscle growth in the muscle groups that we train earlier on in a session where we have less systemic fatigue. So if you're trying to do 12 sets of chest, 12 sets of back, all of that in a single session, then your systemic fatigue might limit how much you're actually able to stimulate your muscle group and could prevent you from making a little bit more progress. So by keeping things within 8 to 10 sets per session, you can kind of maximize your stimulus to fatigue ratio and prevent some junk volume. All right. Now, why might you not want to go much below 2 or 3 sets per session? Well, if you're just doing a single set per session, you're probably not going to be getting a great muscle pump, which is a potential thing that might contribute to some hypertrophy. You're going to have to do a lot of just warming up for each and every muscle group that you're training. So it's probably not super efficient on that end. Additionally, you may not be getting as good of a mind-muscle connection, because I know for me personally, when I'm doing like rows and stuff, it might take me 2 to 3 sets to really start feeling those cable rows in my lats compared to just 1 set. So it kind of lets you get in the groove of training that muscle a little bit better. So I think that could be a pretty decent argument for not doing much less than like 2 or 3 sets per session. So this kind of leaves us with, okay, well, that 2 to 3 to 8 to 10 sets per muscle per session is probably a pretty good idea. And then by looking at your total volume across the entire training week, you can kind of say, okay, if I'm doing 25 sets, then it probably makes sense to do at least 3 sessions. Or, hey, I'm only doing 10 sets. Well, then maybe we're totally fine with just 2 sessions here. And you can split it across like that. Now, I would say that it's still a good idea for 100% to at least train a muscle group twice a week. I think that that is a good minimum there. And I think that from a mechanistic standpoint, it still makes sense that, maybe 3 or 4 times might be just a little bit better than 2, but I don't think we have the data to say that. And it's starting to rain right now, and I don't want to ruin my mic, so let's kind of walk this way here. But that's probably a pretty good range. Now, there's something else to consider here, and that is, for smaller muscle groups, I think that it makes more sense to train more frequently. For example, how much of an additional stimulus are you actually going to get for lateral raises beyond like 5 or 6 sets? Probably not much. Like, I doubt that your 7th set of dumbbell lateral raises is really getting you much of an extra percent on a single session basis. So for that muscle group, maybe you limit it to 5 or 6 sets per session. So if you're doing 20 sets of delts, maybe it's a good idea to train that muscle group around 4 times per week. Same thing could be said for a muscle group like the biceps. How much of a stimulus are you actually getting for each set beyond 5 or 6? Maybe not a ton. So for those more small muscle groups, I think that it makes some practical sense to keep things at a little bit higher of a frequency. So my general recommendation is for larger muscle groups, maybe the legs, 2 to 4 times a week, good sweet spot. Same thing for chest, back, but maybe for the biceps, triceps, delts, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Maybe 3 to 5 might be a little bit better of an approach for those muscle groups. Now, some people will ask about, well, what do you think about like a 5-day-a-week full body training program? What do you think about that? And my experience hasn't been great with those. And quick story about a client, Baptiste, if you're watching this, I did ask you if I could make this, but hopefully you're cool with it. For my other clients watching this, hey, how you doing? Love you guys. But Baptiste was like, hey man, what do you think about trying a full body 5-day per week split? I was like, yeah man, that's cool. Let's do it. And things went really well. He was loving it, really enjoying it. First mesocycle went great. Going to that second mesocycle, we're a couple weeks in, he's like, dude, I'm having trouble sleeping. I'm feeling pretty fatigued. I'm just feeling more beat up, and I didn't hardly change his volume at all. We've been working together for a very long time, and I've got a really good idea of the volume range that works well for him, and I didn't change it like hardly much at all going to the full body split. And he was finding himself being more fatigued with a similar amount of volume. And I've had this similar thing with other clients I've tried this out with. It's almost like there's a sweet spot to where if you train too frequent, like 5 or 6 days a week, you never really get a chance to like fully recover, and that almost hurts your recovery with a similar amount of volume. So we brought things back down to a more reasonable volume and more of an upper lower pull push leg split, and things were great. So I think that 2 to 4 frequency per week is really solid for most people, and maybe having like single mesocycles to where you kind of ramp the volume up for a single muscle and play with 5 or 6 days a week, I think that can work, but I don't think that might not be the most sustainable approach for most people. So for your training frequency, I think that I would look at how much total volume are you doing per muscle per week. All right. Now let's spread that volume out in 3 to 8 to 10 sets per session. And then based on how much total volume and spreading it out between 3 to 8 sets per session, then you know about how many sessions to do per week. And then for those smaller muscle groups, maybe it's just splitting that volume up into 2 to 6 sets per session, and maybe a little bit more frequent might make sense as well. So that's all I got this week. Next week, might as well keep this programming thing going, and we'll discuss training to failure, how to periodize that, and all that sort of thing. I appreciate you guys, and I will see you next week.